Well, welcome back, folks. Hope you enjoyed your break and got a few things done. I know I did here. So we're ready to get going here again. I've got Chris Valaire, who will be our next speaker. Chris, you can turn on your camera and mic, and you'll show up here as well. You'll just click on him down below there, and he should pop up beside me. Perfect. So Chris and I have known each other for quite a few years. Chris is a multidisciplinary natural resource professional with extensive management experience in forestry consulting, the private sector, and in various Alberta government leadership roles as well. As a forestry superintendent with Tolko's Athabasca operations, both Slave Lake and High Prairie, familiar areas for me too. His primary role is Indigenous relations with 15 First Nations and 3 Métis settlements, leading the consultation and engagement processes for Tolko. He's been involved with First Nations and Métis consultation in BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, related to large-scale natural resource projects for over 20 years. Chris is an Eco Canada licensed trainer. He's authorized to create and deliver environmental training courses to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across Canada. Formerly, Chris is also trained as a lead auditor in ISO 14001, ISO 9001, and is passionate about volunteering and staying current with forest industry best management practices. Chris was the president, actually, of the College of Alberta Professional Foresters, CAP, as it was known back in 2010, which is now called the Alberta Association of Forest Management Professionals. Chris's credentials include being a registered professional forester in both Alberta and Saskatchewan. He's also a certified engineering technologist and a nationally regulated environmental professional. Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you, buddy. You can tee up your presentation, and I'll melt into the background here.
Thanks, Hudson. Appreciate the intro. Hopefully everybody can hear me. One moment here. All right, hopefully everybody can see my presentation. I appreciate Lindsay and Hudson going through some of the technical challenges to put on an event of this magnitude. So thanks to everyone for attending today. First and foremost, I would like to acknowledge I'm speaking to you from traditional Treaty 8 territories in the Lesser Slave region. I've been asked to provide an industry perspective on Indigenous rights related to forest management. I also would like to acknowledge the fact that we do have some people from Northwest Territories, the Yukon, BC, Saskatchewan, and other jurisdictions. My apologies if we willfully omitted you in this regard, but it was more specific to the Rocky Mountain sections. So once again, thanks for everybody for attending today, and I appreciate the introduction. So with respect to what we're going to try to cover today from an industry standpoint is looking at treaty areas, settlement areas within Alberta, looking at Indigenous rights. There's a lot of misconceptions related to consultation and engagement, so I'll try to define and clarify the distinction between the two aspects there. Discuss free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC. Talk about Alberta's Historical Resources Act, Alberta companies, forestry certification, and what that means in terms of Indigenous rights and impacts to treaty rights. Talking about silviculture harvest operations on drip. A lot of folks have heard about that, so I'll elaborate a little bit more on what that means. Talk a little bit more about different business paradigms, different business models within the forestry sector in relation to Indigenous rights. And then, of course, we'll have at the back end a Q&A session. So first and foremost, I would like to acknowledge WSP. So they've provided the map on the left side of my presentation. And on the right side is FMA map provided by Alberta Forestry and Agriculture. And I think they even put it rural development in there as well. But as you can see, for folks that may not know, is we have Treaty 7 at the southern portion of Alberta, signed in 1877. Treaty 6, Central Alberta, signed in 1876. And then Treaty 8, which is mostly northern Alberta, signed in 1899. As you can see, the interface between the three treaty areas, not really mentioning Treaty 10, but if you look at Treaty 6, 7, and 8 in relation to spatial proximity to FMAs across Alberta, well, wherever there's FMAs, there's either First Nation reserves and or Métis settlements, or both. So as you can see, there's a tremendous amount of engagement, lots of interface between the forestry sector and Indigenous organizations right across Alberta, right? So The paramount significance of that, we'll talk a bit more in a bit, but obviously these, Indigenous organizations, First Nations and Métis, we live within their communities, we operate within their communities and traditional lands. So Rob and Kurt and other subsequent speakers will talk more about the significance of that. But obviously with the forestry sector, there's higher expectations from the public for Indigenous organizations. And that's just a good thing. That's where the world is going. So we need to be mindful of that and certainly do everything in our industry to do what we can to do the proper thing at the right time. So talking a little bit about Indigenous rights in forestry. So that is enshrined in the Constitution Act back in 1982, which formally recognizes First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. So this goes way back into the Dominion, but 1701, the British Crown at that time entered into numbers of different treaties. In fact, across Canada, there's over 70 historically recognized treaties. But basically, that was a premise behind the fur trade and supply chain and predictability of the fur trade, with a lot of those fur pelts going back to the UK. In subsequent years, then obviously there was a number of treaties in Ontario, right across the prairies, Northwest Territories. What that also included was First Nations specifically ceding and surrendering rights to the land in exchange for certain treaty rights. Now, with respect to the 70 treaties that are recognized across Canada, no two are the same, but the commonalities between all of them is still preservation on reserve lands and utilization within treaty areas for reserve lands, utilizing hunting, fishing, even some historical things like blankets, ammunition, but they're always the rights to utilize the land, to respect those traditional land uses, hunting, fishing of that nature, medicinals, things of that nature. Métis came a little bit later in the time continuum, but those are typically under provincial jurisdiction. So settlements were negotiated directly with provinces in those respective jurisdictions. So Alberta Agriculture, Forestry, Rural Development, I know that's a mouthful, used to be SRD in the old days, does require industry to consult where there is potential impacts to traditional uses on treaty and settlement lands. So that could be on First Nation reserve, on settlement land, and or adjacent to within the treaty area, regardless if it's Treaty 6, 7, or 8. The provincial legislation, so it's indicated there, Forest Act, TMR, Timber Management Regulations, specifically Section 100, the planning standard, and OGRs. Those are typically FMA specific, but there are provincial, generic OGRs as well that have been put together. Those are forestry sector's legal obligations that we have to follow and maintain. Indigenous consultation is involved with all aspects of the forestry operations. Everybody's aware of that on here. All full spectrum planning, harvesting operations, and silviculture. With respect to Indigenous organizations, so in different degrees of consultation between different nations and Métis, looking at the FMP, different voids within the FMP, General Development Plan, 5-year planning horizon, Final Harvest Plans, AOP. Of course, the AOP is your legal authority to harvest. Fire Control Plan and Herbicide Management Plans. So in different aspects, different First Nations and Métis will get actively engaged with that consultation process. And at the end of the day, and I think Todd talked about it earlier, there's lots of different consultation processes that we'll talk a little bit more here in a few moments. So there's a lot of misconceptions, not necessarily in our industry, but from the public and a lot of people in general about what's the differentiation between consultation and engagement. So consultation is our legal and fiduciary responsibility that we have to, the duty to accommodate and to consult with Indigenous organizations. Now, that's related to the forestry sector and all our operations there within. So it has to be a transparent and sharing of different types of information. So this could include shape files, it can include KML files for Google Earth, pretty much anything that would allow us to interface with Indigenous organizations to be in full disclosure on our operations and how it impacts treaty rights, regardless of what treaty area it's in. Lots of First Nations and Métis have created their own consultation processes. I think Todd talked about that from a Swan River First Nation perspective. And the reason for that is because they felt that either federal or provincial standards were not adequate to meet the certain needs of the nation or Métis. So they've created their own consultation standards on both sides of it, whether it be the forestry sector, ACO, the Crown, and industry. Obviously, the consultation process is documented for legal and due diligence purposes, right? Engagement is a bit more of the relationship building. So yes, we're natural resource managers, but at the end of the day, this is a relationship-based business, right? So whether we're talking to clients, the public, Indigenous organizations across the province, across the country for that matter, but engagement really points to the establishment and maintenance of a relationship, an informal partnership. Now, there's still exchanging of information in the absence of legal consultation, but this is more of proximity to towns and operations that we live in. And so the whole intent here is to create a meaningful, mutually beneficial relationship. And I've provided a few examples there. So looking at volume supply agreements, contract and consulting opportunities, those are always coming up. Procurement of goods and services, certain forestry sector companies look at any way they can provide any community investment, regardless of what that is. Training and employment opportunities. And then some companies have obviously pursued, even to a greater extent, becoming Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business certified as well. And there's a whole bunch of different progressive procurement hiring practices within the CCAB as well. Slight delay on my end. Sorry, folks. There we go. So talking a little bit about free, prior, and informed consent, or known as FPIC. So as we know, the forestry sector within Alberta and all other provinces for that matter have the duty to consult and accommodate where possible, specifically where there's demonstrated impacts to treaty rights and traditional land use from said operations, regardless if it's harvesting, silviculture, road construction, regardless of what it is. This also comes back to some recent rulings with the BC Supreme Court related to a First Nation BC, where there's some discussion around cumulative impacts. And this is not just indicative of the forestry sector, but mining, oil and gas, talking a bit more about cumulative impacts. Won't really elaborate too much on that, but ultimately, I think it's safe to say that the landscape is changing out there, and the expectations on, regardless of oil, gas, mining, forestry, the expectations for proper environmental stewardship, proper consultation engagement, that's seeing a far greater prevalence in case law, as well as expectations right across society in general. So Indigenous organizations do provide the companies with historically sensitive spiritual hunting areas, traditional land use, hunting, fishing of that nature. And it is the forestry sector's responsibility, primary responsibility, to do everything within their capability operationally and logistically to mitigate some of these impacts. Now, case in point, there are obviously some compromise, and really trying to focus on the common things that we can agree upon as opposed to the things we don't. And that does come back to, negotiations and compromise. And there are things in the forestry sector, and everybody at the conference is fully aware of it, that there are no-go issues, i.e. buffers or mineral licks or certain culturally sensitive areas that, we just simply can't go in for obvious reasons. Now, because of free and prior and informed consent, that does not necessarily mean veto power, right? Specifically under treaty lands. But the whole process for free and prior and informed consent means that you have to be, respectful, meaningful, and collaborative in that process, and fully transparent. And it has to be solutions focused. Sometimes there will be a no, but we're hoping that we can come through an understanding and respectful dialogue, that all parties involved, we can come to an understanding that makes sense for all parties that are at the table discussing these things. I want to talk a little bit about Alberta's Historical Resources Act. So now there's the ACO, that's the consultation process, but whether it be the timber management regulations or even federal like Fisheries Act or Migratory Birds Convention Act, the Historical Resources Act is very significant in terms of certain operations, harvesting, road building, things of that nature. So a company has to do these proper assessments and submit into Alberta Culture for an approval before they can start doing any layout or site operations. Now, to date, there's been thousands of these historical sites that have been cataloged, and they're certainly known to the government in terms of the interface between the forestry sector, and they have to be preserved under the Historical Resources Act. But there's literally thousands of these artifacts. This could be even shavings to arrowheads to pots, and I'll talk a bit more about some of these sites on the right-hand side in a moment. But what you typically start off with is a rudimentary or a preliminary historical resources overview, HRO. And then depending on the outcomes of that exercise, then you may proceed after that based on your assessment, or it's more culturally significant. So now we have to get in, the archaeologists to do a full excavation to do something called an HRIA, which is a historical resources impact assessment. Very detailed, itemized listing of all culturally significant artifacts. And all this information is disclosed to Alberta Culture as well as to the proponent, the forestry sector, plus the Indigenous organization that it could potentially impact. At that point, then we go into a full discussion phase of the conversation, looking at ways to mitigate that buffering, realignment of roads, realignment of block boundary, what have you, to see where we can mitigate and certainly preserve those culturally significant artifacts. Some of the sites recorded could include, and this is not a mutually exclusive list, historical cabins, cabin remains, campsites, old homesteads, things of that nature. We come across this a fair amount, specifically if we don't have coverage for high resolution LiDAR, but unregistered grave sites, burials, and cemeteries. This happens a fair amount. A lot of this is anecdotal and by word of mouth, so we certainly have to be respectful of that and do everything we can to mitigate that and to at least acknowledge what's going on there and put the proper processes in place so that we're looking at that from an operational viewpoint. Ceremonial sites and spiritual sites. So once again, very significant. Ceremonial plant and mineral gathering sites, so medicinals. That's certainly something we see a fair amount here, specifically as we come into breakup. Trail features, other generic miscellaneous historical sites, and then more of aspects related to First Nations Métis. So where you got sweat lodges, thirst and fasting lodges, and oral history sites. So having conversations with elders, they'll mention certain sites that need to be looked at before you can proceed. This is significant, and as forestry operations goes into new areas, new layout, new harvest sequences come up, this will become more and more of critical importance for the forestry industry to be mindful of. So talking a little bit about forestry certification. Now, why does this have any relevance to Indigenous organizations? And I'll get into that in a moment, but a little bit of background. So most of the industry within Alberta either has Sustainable Forest Initiative, SFI, or Forest Stewardship Council, FSC certification. Now, there's a variety of business and environmental stewardship reasons. There's even some marketing aspects to it. But ultimately, the whole premise behind it is to get credibility in that forestry sector in relation to the public, with the government, the different regulatory bodies, and more importantly, with Indigenous organizations. In Alberta, well, just over 35 million hectares is forested land base. Certified forest areas back in 2000 was just under 2 million hectares. 2009, it was 20 million hectares. And today it's over 21 million hectares. It's either certified under FSC or SFI. So that's a tenfold increase. Now, if you do a bit of the math, that's about 60% of the forests in Alberta are certified under one of those two certification regimes. And I think that's increasing every single year. Now, the two certification regimes do differ from one another. They have different objectives, different metrics, quantitatively and qualitatively, that they measure. But ultimately, it comes back to demonstrating you're following regulatory approvals, you're following your procedures, and more importantly, there's adequate consultation and engagement with the different Indigenous organizations to a different degree, right? So there are expectations in both certifications, and that's why some of the other forestry sector companies have adopted like UNDREP or CCAB in conjunction with SFI or FSC certification. Third-party audits on the forest operations, planning procedures. So that's a third-party audit of your operations to make sure you're doing what you say you're going to be doing. Annual service audits or surveillance audits are completed, and these are fully publicly disclosed so that anyone can see what's going on with that industry. So you can put your stamp on your 2x4s or your OSB. Regulatory compliance audits are then comparatively analyzed to Alberta Forestry, so the Forest Operations Monitoring Program. So how well did industry do in relations to what the expectations are under the operating ground rules and inspections conducted by the Crown. Talking a little bit about silviculture and harvest operations. So we talked a little bit earlier about the consultation and engagement process, but if we look at the higher level plans like the FMP, the GDP, FHPs, and AOPs, First Nations and Métis conduct their own site inspections, even site assessments, which is more indicative of the Impact Assessment Act of Canada, which is more of an environmental impact assessment, typically what you see in oil and gas, and general operations monitoring. So whether it be spray operations, brush saw, even buffering on creeks. A lot of the First Nations Métis conduct their own site assessments. These are ongoing right throughout the whole year. It doesn't matter if it's winter or summer wood. And compensation capacity funding is negotiated between the First Nation Métis and the forestry company. And there's a whole myriad of different ways to approach that. And I think it's safe to say that that's only going to increase in time. Some First Nations Métis just default back to provincial inspection standards, whereas some First Nations Métis have really, with internal GIS capacity, as well as their own internal capacity, have created their own inspection forms that gets passed between the forestry sector and themselves. I want to talk a little bit about UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So this was ratified by the federal government back in June of 2021. Now, at that time, the federal government, they ratified it. They gave themselves a 2-year time frame to create an implementation plan, because they still have to obviously, liaise and communicate with the provinces in terms of how that's going to impact them. Actually, in some places within Canada, some First Nations refused to acknowledge that because they weren't part of the decision-making process up front, which is kind of an interesting and puzzling dynamic that the federal government would adopt it without talking to Indigenous organizations, but it is what it is. With respect to Alberta, it has recognized that this act is coming and is more or less waiting to see how the federal government deals with their obligations on reserve land, but also in treaty lands, and how it interacts with provincial legislation, whether it be the Forest Act, the TMR planning standards, and all these other higher level plans. Excuse me. Examples would include under UNDRIP, like road building in relation to Forestry Fisheries Act. So what does that mean in terms of delegated authority between the federal government, Fisheries Act, and provincial legislation? Structure retention, which is typically covered under DFMP voids, related to Migratory Birds Convention Act. So what does that mean to the forestry sector in terms of timing and sequencing of operations? Caribou protection plans, obviously under the species at risk, caribou is certainly a species of significant concern from Indigenous organizations. So how does that get handled between UNDRIP, the federal government, and provincial government to make sure there's proper stewardship of that certain species? The Alberta government has adopted some UNDRIP requirements, so protocol agreements, those are pending and those are being developed as we speak. The legal duty to accommodate and consult, that hasn't changed. And then the framework documents related to the Métis of Alberta. So some forestry companies have actually adopted the covenants within UNDRIP, regardless of the time frame from the federal government as well as the provincial governments. So some companies have actually adopted that and started putting measures in place to adhere and align with the certain covenants within UNDRIP. So talking a bit about some business models, and this really isn't exclusive to Alberta, but you're looking at all of Canada for that matter. But what you've really started to see is an evolution in equity ownership in forestry operations, jointly managed land base and tenure. So this goes back to Fairy Creek in BC, but you're starting to see governments provincially really start to look at how forest tenure is structured and how it can be more inclusive to getting Indigenous organizations within planning, operations, and revenue sharing. So that's an ongoing, evolving process, but you're starting to see a lot more of that conversation moving forward. Expectations on harvest systems, so selection, harvest, seed tree retention, that's just a gimme. Expectations around, different types of, the old checkerboard layout and harvesting, those days are gone. We're looking at emulating fire, looking at ecological preservation, structure retention, and agroforestry. So there's a lot more emphasis on more holistic and traditional ways of doing forestry, and including Indigenous organizations into the planning process so that those values are reflected in more Western science-based forestry approaches. Seen a lot of prevalence of biomass to biofuel facilities. So with respect to either pile burning, you're starting to see a lot of companies coming forward looking at ways to utilize that biomass and then convert it into other forms of energy, biofuels, biodiesels, things of that nature. What you also started to see within the forestry sector is a lot more of an inclusive procurement practice, which basically looks at selection criteria for RFPs and things of that nature to make sure that First Nations are certainly included in a lot of these opportunities. And that goes under CCAB, under UNDRIP, and just get good general business practices. Lots of good momentum, specifically here in the Lesser Slave region, but I know this is right across Alberta, where you're starting to see a lot of really good FRIA projects that are being funded, whether it be traditional lands to wetlands preservation to wildlife mitigation strategies. Lots of really good projects that'll benefit the industry as well, more importantly, benefit Indigenous organizations in how that impacts their traditional land use. Seeing a lot of different Indigenous consortiums that are being formed and how that interfaces with industry in general. So for example, in that Whitecourt area, you've seen Enoch, Alexis, Alexander, and Paul Band form a new financial consortium. And they're starting to really exert financial leverage in the marketplace. And it doesn't matter what industry it's in, you're really starting to see some power and scalability of First Nations because they've formed these consortiums. And there's a greater expectation that now industry has to certainly work in a far more greater capacity with Indigenous organizations because of that market flexibility and power that they have. I think from my perspective, I've been in the industry for 25 years, but it's my own opinion, but the forestry sector has always done, in my opinion, a very good job of providing, training, opportunity, mentoring, and for Indigenous organizations, regardless of where they operate. So that's always going to be a work in progress, but that includes different community investments, scholarships, things of that nature. So that's always going to be a work in progress. But I think that's a very positive note that the industry has. Here's just some links to a few of the things that I've talked about. I know Kurt and Rob talked a bit about that as well, but I put a couple of links on there as well. So once Hudson and the CIF team put this on, you can have a look at that at your convenience. And that concludes my presentations. Is there any questions for me?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, we'll open up the floor. I don't see any questions in the Q&A or the chat windows, but we'll give people a few minutes here if they want to put it in there. I did have one though for you, Chris, because you'd mentioned it, and I know I've run into it a few times. You'd mentioned around the inclusive procurement practices, and I know there's certain companies out there, TransAlta's one, Suncor, and a few of the others, where they've actually set up a separate Indigenous procurement process, that sits separate and is run separate. It's a little bit different, right, than the typical one. Is that kind of what you're thinking about, or is that what you're getting at? And I guess maybe expand a bit on that if you can.
Yeah, that's correct, Hudson. So, for selection for criteria for certain RFPs, and like for us as a company, and I won't speak for other companies, so please apologize ahead of time, but for Tolko, being a CCAB member, one of our selection criteria for procurement on our RFPs, if you're a CCAB member, obviously there's certain heightened selection criteria that are in our RFPs for that very reason. We will be very mindful of, all things being equal, the cost, the quality of service, what have you. But if we're looking at an Indigenous organization that can provide that, then we'll certainly look at supporting that any way we can. And that's just one example of many. That can include procurement of services, goods, consulting, what have you, trailers, any types of equipment, anything that we can do to support Indigenous organizations in our region. We've made commitments corporately to do that. And I know all the companies in forestry right across Alberta and Canada, for that matter, have done the same thing to a different degree. But, this is, I wouldn't say it's a solution, but it's part of a very small issue related to reconciliation on the economic side, right? So.
Okay. And you mentioned that the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, or CCAB certification. I'm familiar with that as well. Have you been running into that more often nowadays, or is that still fairly new? Or I guess what's your experience, I guess, in dealing with that in your job?
Yeah, I think initially when it started off, Hudson, I wouldn't call it symbolic, but a lot of folks became members just because they thought it was the right thing to do, and it was. But now what you've seen with industry and then companies that do get CCAB certified, and there's even bronze, silver, and gold certification under par that you can get. Now it really starts to talk about progressive hiring practices, procurement practices, inclusivity of businesses within that. So even to the most minor detail of your operation to large scale procurement practices. So, good on CCAB. It's more of a, do you have to do it? No. But a lot of companies have said there's some value here, so we need to pursue this. In addition to forestry certification, in addition to some of the other things that industry has done.
Yeah, no, and I concur. I know that I've run into some of the clients and companies I've worked with. It seems to be becoming a growing trend, and a lot of them are actually pointing directly to it. Do you have that, right? Before they really want to talk to you.
Well, we've made a point at our company. If you have CCAB, we will certainly make a point to make sure our business heads your way. Let's put it that way.
Okay, good. Okay. I don't see any other comments, although you got quite a few accolades there from a few folks.
I guess I put everybody to sleep, eh?
No, I think they're digesting. It was good content. So if there's no other questions, I appreciate you, Chris, coming here today and taking the time to give the talk that you did. What we'll do then? Oh, whoops! I think we might have one more here. Let me have a look. Oh yeah, here we go. It's from Kyle C. You mentioned that the free, prior, and informed consent component of UNDRIP doesn't equate to giving Indigenous communities veto power. Is this an accurate interpretation of EPIC?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Kyle. So that's a bit of an interesting, I wouldn't even call it a dilemma. That's basically being debated on what that means. Because you're right, they can't be diametrically opposed. So what industry's tried to do is interpret that and say, look, we're going to do everything we can to honor free and prior informed consent. Full disclosure of all information on what our operations means to potential impacts to treaty lands or traditional lands. With respect to UNDRIP, there are certain covenants within there that talks about veto power. So this is where the compromise in the conversation comes in, is what does that actually mean? Now, when I was working on the coast of BC, there is no treaties. So by default and de facto, it's almost an informal veto power over operations. Within treaty lands, treaties 6, 7, and 8, there's certainly some different legal nuances there. I'm not a lawyer, but that interpretation of what that means is currently being worked out. What I guess we could take home from that is that the industry is trying to do the best they can to honor free and prior and informed consent. In other words, full disclosure of everything that we're doing, ongoing dialogue, joint site inspections, and doing everything to mitigate some of those concerns. That being said, does that mean that a certain First Nation or Métis has the ability to say, no, it's not going to happen? At the end of the day, that's debatable, because ultimately it's Crown land. On Crown land, though, we still have to respect and do everything we can to mitigate any potential negative impacts to traditional lands and treaty rights. So that's where a bit of the interpretation comes in. I'm not trying to put a word salad on this. I'm just saying that this is evolving, and that conversation, unfortunately, we've got too many lawyers involved with it. But ultimately, this does have on the ground implications with cost implications. So that has to be worked out into the whole conversation in a very respectful and collaborative way. So Kyle, that's my long-winded COVID answer for you.
I think that was a good response. And I think you're right. It's the reality is that much of it is still being processed and worked through and to be determined, essentially. So it's difficult to really nail anything down to a certain degree at this point. So
and this comes back a bit to the veto power. When it comes to that, then is that been a whole breakdown in consultation engagement? It shouldn't have to come to that, because if there's good, meaningful, transparent, and solutions-focused dialogue, in my estimation, it shouldn't come to that. But you almost seen that in some cases, First Nations and Métis, where they feel that's their only recourse, because they feel they're not being respected in that conversation. But in my mind, if it actually goes to that, then I almost see it as a breakdown in that whole process, and that they've come to, the straw that broke the camel's metaphorical back, which is unfortunate, but a reality.
No, that's fair. Okay, I don't see any other questions, so I guess we'll wrap it up there and give everyone a little early start in their lunch. So once again, thanks, Chris. I appreciate you taking the time today. I really enjoyed the presentation. And yeah, folks, like I said before, these are all being recorded. They'll be made available to attendees here after the session at some point. So what I'll do now is I'll stop presenting here. I'll turn everyone loose, and then we'll start up again here at 1 o'clock as per the agenda with our next presentation. So thanks, folks. Have a good lunch, and we'll see you guys in about an hour and I guess 23 minutes. Right.
Thanks, everybody.
Chris.
Thank you.
You bet. Okay, bye.